Hello 3D artists, this is 3D Ray, and I will be going over how to distribute decals or any geometry along a spline or a curve, however you wish to call it. This is useful for placing rivets, let's say, on a vehicle, for placing bolts along a certain edge loop that you would like to have it distributed on. Today I'll be demonstrating this technique with a model called suction pump. This is a pump that was used on a vehicle that I recently worked on. And if I put on the textures here, you will see that this pump has holes that go around this cylindrical part here. Now these holes are currently painted directly on the texture set. It is also efficient for both texture size and keeping these holes crisp to create them as one decal and then duplicate that along this cylinder. So I'm going to demonstrate how to do that with Mesh. Mesh is a system that you'll find in the animation menu right here. It has animation functions to it as well. For our purposes today, we will be using it simply to distribute geometry along a curve or spline. So I'll get to it. I'll go back to gray. And the first thing I'll do is I'll create the spline. So to do that with Maya, I'll go with my multi-cut tool. And if I hold down Control, it'll make it go across many faces. So I'm going to put it in here. And this is simply to create a spline for the distribution. Now, currently it's just an edge loop. So what I'll do is I'll select this spline, this edge loop, and if you go to Modify, Convert, Polygon Edges to Curve, this will create the curve from a polygon edge. So I'll hit that, and there it is. Now that carries a history that if I go here to the model again, I'll isolate that, and I delete the curve, the edge loop, the curve will disappear as well. So even though it appears here on the outliner, if I look in the viewport, it's nowhere to be found. Okay, so we don't want to do that, so I'll just backtrack here. Okay, if I choose the curve again, there it is. What I want to do is hit history, delete history, and just as a tip as well, I use a custom shelf with my most used and functions that I find them I commonly use, and this is always good to have. You don't have to go searching through menus to do things that you normally do very often. So we have our curve here. Now, after having deleted history, I can go back and select the edge loop and delete. I don't really need it on the geometry. Once I have this curve, I'm going to create a plane for decals. So I'm going to go hit plane. There it is. It already has just one division. one by one, I believe. Yes. And that's all I need. Now, here's something most tutorials won't tell you, or just they will just assume that you will know some things without further explanation. The decal, or whatever you're going to distribute along the spline or the curve, needs to remain at origin. If it's not at origin, it will not work properly. So I'm going to leave it there. And just for organization, I'm just going to rename this to test decal, and I'm going to rename this to test curve. Okay, the next step is I'm going to select the geometry, and I'm in my animation menu, which can be found here. Normally, you would be in the modeling menu or any other of these, depending on your specialty. But there are useful things in each of these menus. So Mesh is in the animation submenu, and we're going to go here, create mesh network. Now, after becoming acquainted with this process, you might just want to click on this, but I usually like to select the dialog box, and that way I can see what options are available to me when creating this node. What I'll go ahead and do here is rename this test decal string, and the distribution is a straight line along the curve. So I'm going to go ahead and hit apply and close, and what it did was it puts it right here. Now I want it along the curve. Now why didn't it do that? Because we have to attach the curve to the mesh node. So I'm going to pull my attribute editor right here, and this is the node we just created, the mesh network. There are many options here to explore. The one we have to concern ourselves with for this process is curve. So I'm going to go ahead and add curve node, and it'll give me this tab, curve, and also this tab will be of importance, the distribute tab, and I'll go into that in a moment. But in the curve tab, here's the space where we need to drag the curve that we're using. So I'll go ahead and middle mouse, drag, and now it's reading that curve. Now, a few things to remember. In the curve tab, the step, you want it to be 1. Sometimes Maya has some strange default settings, and I would consider that to be 1. Now, it still doesn't look right. The reason for that, and I'm going to go ahead and also put animation speed and noise down. Now, that has its use, but we're not animating anything here for our purposes. I'll go to the distribute tab, and the reason it doesn't look right is because here's another strange Maya setting, default setting. Distribute X is set to 20. We want that to be 0. And now, as you can see, the decals now follow the curve. And depending on the number of copies of that decal or geometry, you can put whatever number you would like. As you can see, I'm increasing it, or you can bring it down. I kind of need a spacing kind of similar to that, I would say. Put it at 22. Okay, now another thing you may notice is that the normals on this are reversed. So what you do is you can go and click on the original decal. Now, what happened here is that when you create the mesh network, it actually hides the original geometry. It's still there, so I'll bring it back, and there it is. Now, I need to rotate this 180, so I'll pick rotate X, put 180 there, and as you can see, I'll put the edge view. They are now rotated correctly, and the normals are facing outward. Now, one last thing, they are very flush with the surface of the suction pump here. So what we need to do is actually grab the curve, make sure that the manipulator is centered on that curve. And I have center pivot right here in my custom shelf, but you can also find it in modify center pivot. So I'll go ahead and center the pivot, and I'm going to scale out that curve, and it pushes the decals outward as well. Now, if you have a straight line, let's say this line was the curve upon which you were distributing the decals, you would have to use translate for that to jut it out from being too close to the surface. I just used the scale tool because this was a circle curve. I'll go ahead and hide that curve, and it makes it easier to see the geometry that we just distributed on that curve. And that is how you use the mesh network to distribute geometry along a curve. And you know, it could be not just a plane, but it could be any sort of geometry. In fact, if I go here and let's go ahead and poke the face here, I'm going to grab this vertice and pull it down to create a sort of pyramid shape. If I come back here, you can see that that still is carrying the history of any changes that I make to the original geometry. And that can be very powerful, you know, as you to edit on the fly. But that is how you distribute geometry along a curve or spline using the mesh network. This concludes this tutorial on how to distribute geometry along a curve using the mesh network. And thank you for watching. If you liked the tutorial, please go ahead and subscribe. There will be more tutorials coming along with more tips and tricks, obscure features of not just 3D software, but all kinds of creative software. And I hope you stay tuned for that. Thank you for watching, and until next time, this is 3D Ray.